officially welcome you to our, I guess, the third in our series of workshops. This is mandatory COVID-19 vaccine testing by employers. We have a terrific two of my favorite people in government and labor today as our panelists, who I'm going to introduce in a little while. But there's a couple of housekeeping items that I want to take care of. First is that throughout this presentation, if you have a question, please make sure to put that in the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen, not in the chat box, in the Q&A. So if you have a question, put it in there and we will make sure to answer it accordingly. If we don't get to your question, because I have a feeling this might go over a little bit over the hour that we have allotted, please send it to me and I will make sure to forward it to Joe and Julian, and we will get back to you accordingly. There will be a PowerPoint presentation, although we are not going to follow it. It will be there as a guide and as a reference, and we will make that available to you after the workshop later today. And then if for the continuing education credits, please make sure to contact Lauren in our office and she will make sure to forward you the certificates accordingly. For the CLE credits, this course has been approved for 1.2 CLE credits for you. So for you lawyers out there, there will be 4 breaks during this presentation. Make sure to write down the word, send them to us, and we'll make sure to get your certification. But don't worry, if you don't get all the words down, we will have a list of attendees, and we'll make sure to get your certificate. So make sure you stay on, because this is a great workshop. So I also want to take a minute to thank Angela Wolf again, who does a terrific job at running these workshops for us, and would highly recommend them for any functions that you use in your county or town or business. She does a terrific job. Next, I want to thank our sponsors, of course, Genova Burns, our labor council, and you can hear from Joe in 1 second. But I also want to, of course, thank our new friends at Ernst & Young. And I know we have Jackie Taylor and Fran Exley on the line, and going to give them a minute to talk about the great things that Ernst & Young does. And Jackie and I are I guess, long lost neighbors. So Jackie or Fran, if you're on, the floor is yours.
Sure. I'll kick us off. Again, Jackie Taylor. I serve as the lead partner for EY here in the state of New Jersey, and really excited about our new business associate membership with NJAC, largely because we recognize that it is so important to connect with local leadership as we grapple with some of the challenges that we're all encountering in this decade, right? Unanticipated. I just wanted to share, and then I'll throw to Fran to just give a minute to share with you some of the things that we're doing. We are having these very conversations across the country and globally, quite frankly. And my goal as a state of New Jersey partner is to bring those conversations, those exemplars, those challenges and how they were overcome to you all as you strategize and figure out local solutions to vaccination, to testing, and to increasing the public confidence in your geographies going forward. So again, my goal is to localize that, bring that to you so that you can incorporate some of those bumps in the road to avoid them in your local strategies. But I do have the privilege of having my colleague Fran Exley on, who will just give an overview of what some of that consists of. And then, as always, as John said, I am available here locally to help you ideate and think through these as you move forward. Fran?
All right, thanks, Jackie, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, I should say. I'm sorry, it already feels like afternoon. First and foremost, just want to thank all of you. I know how hard the testing and the vaccine road has been going, and how challenging it is for you and your organizations. I know that is particularly challenging all of the public health in the counties as we go through this. And in fact, we've been doing at EY, we've got about 500 people working on vaccines right now for all different states and counties, helping the states with their rollouts, helping them with anything from thinking about allocations to setting up mass vax to how do I get shots in arms through setting up vaccine management systems and the like. And I think it is a tremendous undertaking that we're all going to. In fact, I'm getting on this afternoon with all of the Maryland public health departments, and we're going through some of the updates and changes we're making to the pre-registration process to really focus on equity and rollout as we go through some of the activities around that. So as you think and you move forward, I do think that there's going to be 3 big things to focus on. Our simulation models sort of detect that we'll probably have enough vaccine by the end of May, early June, for everyone that wants a vaccine to get it. I think we're hearing that consistently on the news, but our models sort of show that as well, especially based on General Perna's updates last week that we received. With the J&J, vaccine that's coming into the market as well, we're going to see, that, really help things. And then, we'll have a couple of weeks off of that before we ultimately get the next round of that. And I think the three things to be thinking about as you start moving forward and thinking about these discussions today is, one, hesitancy is going to become a major impact that you're going to have to deal with and think through. Two, really, going after the underserved and the equity and putting plans together in order to serve the underserved populations and those that are vaccine hesitant, and making sure that we have the necessary vaccine messages out there. And then finally, vaccine passports and the like. We're seeing more and more interest in, about that. That will take, probably a different approach depending on where you live in the country. And it'll be interesting to see where that goes, but I'm sure that'll factor into your conversations today. So those are three things that we really think you should be thinking about. If you have questions or you want to know, more best practices that we're seeing from other counties around the U.S., as well as what we're, doing with states, more than happy to jump on the phone and just share lessons learned and best practices with you all on that as you continue to move forward. So with that being said, thank you, John, for the opportunity, and really appreciate being here today.
Great. Thank you, Fran, and thank you, Jackie. I appreciate it a great deal and appreciate your thoughts. And again, look forward to working with you. And I just want to take one more second before I introduce Julian and Joe, just to have sad news to report, in that former Middlesex County freeholder Blanquita Valente, who was a longstanding member of NJAC's board of director and just a trailblazing public official in Middlesex County, passed at 87 years yesterday. So she was just a wonderful, terrific, kind woman, and will be greatly missed. So I hope you don't mind that I just took a minute to share that with you, because again, it's just a wonderful person. So with that, I am pleased to introduce two of the finest legal minds in New Jersey that I rely on a great deal, probably too much sometimes, because I know I drive particularly Joe crazy with all the phone calls and text messages and emails, and Julian as well in his role as county administrator and county counsel for Bergen County. So I know these two really, you're very familiar with both of them. Joe is of course with the firm of Genova and Burns, which also serves as NJAC's labor counsel, and Judge Niels, as I'm going to call him for the rest of his days, is the Bergen County administrator and county counsel. So gentlemen, we're gonna kick it off with you, and I'm gonna just kind of start with laying the foundation, because there's been some confusion around whether or not an employer can mandate that an employee be vaccinated. So is that permissible under the law and under guidance that was issued early on in the year by the EEOC under the American Disabilities Act? So I'll open that right up. Joe, Julian?
Yeah, I mean, I wish it were that simple, John, because I think it's led to, a lot of thought, question, and then dealing with, and we'll get into it, dealing with, public employers. You have other issues. I mean, I think the general answer to this, but you got to be careful once I say this, don't turn off the screen, is generally, I think, yes. I mean, you could mandate it, but there are a lot of, mazes to get through. And, especially in the public sector, how are you going to deal with that? What employees do you want to give it to, or do you want to mandate it for? How would you do it? I mean, these are all some of the questions we're going to deal with, but would a different method be better, a voluntary method? But I mean, I think the short answer is yes, but I think we have to unwrap some of that stuff, especially especially in the public sector. And before, I give Julian a thought or two on this. As far as the PowerPoint, everyone, I know John talked about it initially, we put together this PowerPoint. It is going to be available to everyone, especially with two of us talking and John as well. I think it's a better program to go back and forth with questions and talk about it. A lot of the topics we're going to talk about, there are slides on, but I think this will be more interesting for you this way. We'll rely on slides if necessary when the time comes. But I don't know, Julian, you want to have some opening thoughts on this?
Yeah, and John, I agree with Joe that yes, you can mandate it, but as he said, there's a lot of factors that you want to consider before you make that determination. And then you should also look at where do you want to mandate it. So you may have certain sectors of your population, of your work population, that you might want to start with, and it might be a no-brainer. Before you would make a determination whether it should go to your general employee population, there's a lot of considerations that you would want to take into account first and foremost. And one of the practical things that we're all seeing today, for example, is all of our employees are not eligible yet. So the idea of even considering mandatory vaccination before everyone's able to get it is one of the most obvious considerations.
True.
Got you. You threw me there with the eligibility piece of it, but you mean in terms of how the state is phasing in
Exactly.
individuals who are eligible. So it's still early, kind of early in the morning, so it might take me a minute, but I got you now. So I guess would this be a negotiable item then for something for public sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I don't know if I could, well, I don't think it's important to have the slide up. I mean, I could get to it, but listen, that is an issue that we don't know the answer to. It is, all I could say is that knowing PERC, knowing the test, I think that there would certainly be aspects of a vaccine rollout that would be negotiable. Issues such as, who would potentially pay for it, and any leave time for it, those type of issues. I think PERC would definitely come down and say that these are negotiable issues. And I guess kind of a little, no one's here for history, but I think history matters a little bit in this, is that there is a line of cases, U.S. Supreme Court, New Jersey Supreme Court, dating back to the early part of last century, that vaccinations, mandatory vaccinations by the government, in times of need, is permissible. So, if you look at that body of law, what does that say? Well, I think what it says is that if the state were at some point to pass a law saying that, vaccines are for COVID-19 are necessary, and pass a law to that regard, then I think that would likely stick. But what you have here is, if you look at it under PERC, you're looking at the three-part test that we're familiar with. I mean, there's no PERC case that we could take a look at and rely on and say, all right, a mandatory vaccine is negotiable or not negotiable, and here's the case from 1982 that says that doesn't exist. So what you're looking at is the test, and does it intimately and directly affect the work and welfare of public employees? Well, those type of issues usually deal with things like compensation, those type of things. So, you might not be there. Is it preempted by a statute or regulation? Well, we don't have that yet. So you're not going to have a preemption. So it goes to that third prong. Would it significantly interfere with a governmental policy? And that's really where the analysis would come down, from a legal perspective. And we're not gonna truly know the answer to that until we get a PERC ruling on it, which we do not have yet. So, but in looking at it and knowing that, you're dealing with health and safety, which is typically looked at as as things that touch on negotiability, is that you're probably going to have most of the issues concerning vaccination in the workplace, even whether you can mandate it or not. You probably still are going to need to negotiate with your unionized workforce. Would be my educated opinion on it.
And John, just to follow up on Joe's opinion, he hit the nail on the head with the not significantly interfering with governmental policy. That's where you're going to find the rub, especially in the context of a worldwide pandemic, public health emergency. The negotiability of it is probably questionable, but a lot of practical considerations would be, well, why not negotiate it? And even if it's not the actual mandating of the vaccination, but you might want to negotiate the consequences of non-compliance. So you have predictability and employees have an understanding, unions have an understanding. I think if you come to terms around what's going to happen and how you're going to coordinate it and make it available to employees, then you start making it more acceptable, and you make it that'll go over better, I think, with unions when everybody's on the same page about what's going to happen with non-compliance, rather than just an open mandate and then kind of taking it as it is. Once you have an employee who refuses, then what do? You're better off being in a position that you know what the consequences are going to be with the non-compliance, and some may have the legitimate exemptions as well to it. So you're going to have to figure out how you're going to address those with exemptions anyway.
Right. I have a follow-up question, but we have a poll question that you have to answer. So that will be up for 30 seconds, I think is a good time. And you can answer it wrong.
Okay, I'll read it. I see a question. Must the employer show that an unvaccinated employee poses a direct threat due to a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of the individual or others that cannot be eliminated or reduced by reasonable accommodation? And the choices are yes or no.
Or maybe depends, right? We should put.
It always depends, John. You know.
All right. So if say you don't mandate that employees get the vaccine, can you adopt a policy that asks employees, like you take a proactive stance if you've received the vaccine or not, and if they haven't received it, can you ask them to explain why? So I guess it's more of an indirect way of mandating it. And I know that there are some counties that have been talking about adopting that type of policy, where not necessarily requiring it, but asking employees whether or not they've been vaccinated. Joe, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does, and I'm happy to field it. The first part of that, can you ask an employee if they've received a vaccine? The answer to that is yes, you can. The EEOC came out with guidance, and they've determined that whether someone has received a test is not a medical examination. And essentially what they do is it's different than, getting the information of, they show like a blood test or, or urinalysis or something like that would uncover potentially protected confidential medical information. I mean, asking if someone's received a vaccine is not really disclosing any medical information about the individual. And then I think, so therefore, reasonably, it's not considered a medical inquiry that you're receiving confidential medical information. So you could ask that. Where they caution on it is if an individual has not received the test, the why could put an employer into trouble, because now you're going down a path of the why might disclose, well, I'm not, obviously if the person says I'm not taking it because I don't want to, well, now um, you're not getting any information that, you shouldn't have had. But it may disclose, I'm not getting it because I have this condition and I'm just afraid of a reaction or something to that effect. And now you've opened up Pandora's box. You've gone down a line you shouldn't, and now you're disclosing some kind of disability or some condition that you shouldn't have really known about. So that's where you come into place. But I do think, but what that does do is I think it opens the door to have some kind of voluntary system, because there is a way that you could find out who has it.
And to that point as well, I think if you wanted to get to the point of wanting to know the why somebody hasn't, there's an overall policy issue we see now, just talking about the whole vaccine hesitancy that individuals have. So there's a legitimate reason of wanting to know, of wanting to get to the why, even outside of the mandatory vaccination context. But I think to Joe's point, you would really want to craft those questions carefully, that's saying more so, do you have vaccine hesitancy? Do you trust the vaccine, et cetera, et cetera? You probably want more pointed questions like that rather than an open-ended why about not wanting to take the vaccine.
So let me ask you though, so what then do you do with that information just from a practical standpoint? So say you ask an employee if they've been vaccinated and they say no, and you don't have a mandatory policy, what do you do with that information?
And I'll defer to Joe as well, but I think looking at it, taking off my legal hat and kind of putting on the administrator's hat, I want to get a sense of how secure my employees feel, especially once they're going to start coming back to the workplace and other things. So what you might want to do with the information is, if you have a large interest, for example, and you determine from that, putting together programs where you will assist employees with getting vaccinated. If you have partnerships in place, Bergen, we just happen to have a county hospital. We have a series of other hospitals, but even putting together resources that may not all be within your control, and forming other partnerships to try and encourage and assist employees with getting vaccinations. So it can give you that type of information when you see what is the general mood and sense of your employees. And also, whether it's also information you can share to get over vaccination hesitancy, because candidly, what our goal is as statewide is we're trying to get as many people vaccinated as possible. Just watching the news this morning, it wasn't CDC, but it was another authority, ABC. ABC News said that per capita, New Jersey has suffered more deaths than any other state. So there's information like that that's out there that makes you want to use this information in any way, shape, or form you can to try and get people either more educated or vaccinated.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. So you mentioned some guidance coming out from ABC and CDC. Now, does being vaccinated, maybe this goes to the to the question I just asked, does being vaccinated change the rules for when you're quarantining from returning from work? And I know earlier this week, the CDC issued updated guidance, and it seems to, evolve rather quickly. Does that change, again, returning to work or the quarantining piece of it?
Yeah, because I think what we're going to say, and I think, to step back for a second before I answer that question is, as we go on in this process, we know that every day counts, because every day is, if you trust the scientific community, which, we're all at the scientific communities, we're all relying upon them right now to get over this, right? And listen, I understand there's individuals who have legitimate concerns about vaccines. You take a look at you look at the news and you get percentages every day. I think there's some general view that I guess 70% of Americans would be willing to get the vaccine, or I don't know if I was reading the right number at the right time, what have you. But the point is that it is, the more we go on, the more we get information about how long the vaccine will be effective, with the spread. And I think what you saw this week from the CDC is, I assume based on the data that they feel that there is a way to kind of open it up a little bit. The one thing this week what the CDC said, and the way I read it, is this seemed to be, more about, having the grandparents go visit the kids and that type of stuff, and understanding that there is a level of protection and assurance that you can have in small gatherings. I mean, it begs the question of who actually was really policing family get-togethers anyway to begin with. But I think it gives people a little more comfort level of making that step, because I know that you still hear the stories of grandkids for months and a year or whatever. But as far as about returning to work, is I don't think what's happened this week has changed the whole work issue. I still think if you are, whether vaccinated or not vaccinated, whether you are exposed, the fallback is still to try to do the 14-day quarantine. I know in certain sectors, in law enforcement, there are some rules where if you're asymptomatic, you could deal with that. There was one thing in the new guidance that said if you are fully vaccinated, and fully vaccinated means really 2 weeks after the last dose. So whether it's J&J, it's 2 weeks after you got the shot, or Moderna or Pfizer, you're 2 weeks after the second dose. That's when you're fully vaccinated. If you have exposure and but are asymptomatic, there is something in there that you don't have to quarantine, but once you become symptomatic, you do. I think in that respect, I think it's up to employers as to how cautious they want to be in that regard, how quickly they want to, how they want to deal with it, how important that position is, because I still think caution is probably the better way to deal with this. So I still think for the most part you're dealing with the same rules of quarantine. And I think as we go on, like Julian said at the beginning, it's not even mandatory. A lot of individuals can't get it at this point. But I think you'll see that continue to be loosened, would be my guess, because anytime the guidelines are coming out now, they're not being they seem to be going in that direction.
Well, let me ask you this though, because this seems for employers to make matters more complicated with the CDC guidance, not just with the quarantining, but now you have a workplace where maybe you have half are vaccinated and half are not. Do you then kind of change the workplace rules? What do you do then? Or do you keep the same type of safety protocols and other things that a county in particular, a municipality may have adopted moving forward? Because there seems to be so many moving parts. How do you change it if you have some employees vaccinated? How do you change the workplace, or do you?
Some of the things, and even following CDC and other regulations and guidelines, is one aspect that we wouldn't change about the workplace is with the mask requirement, daily screening, daily questionnaires, keeping all that intact and keeping all of it in place. But you bring up a great point, because again, even with regard to the mandatory aspects of who should be required to get vaccinations, we have a long-term care facility, for example. So one of the early determinations there in consultation with CDC, Department of Health, they were all going to have to be vaccinated, especially with what we were seeing amongst fatalities, that being the most vulnerable population. We have vaccination policies now with those who work at our testing facilities and those who actually work at the vaccination facilities, where they have to be vaccinated, more so out of their own health interest. But some of the science that we see also still tells us that somebody who's fully vaccinated can be exposed and still carry. So again, it comes back to still needing to mask up, needing to wash hands, needing to social distance. And regardless of how we get our population increasing of being vaccinated, I anticipate that's going to be the last thing that probably stops. And I would think even once we reach those benchmarks of getting a certain percentage of the population vaccinated, that things like mask wearing and social distancing and thermal temperature scans on a daily basis are going to continue for a while. Because again, it's not 100% of the population. That's even the goal for vaccination anyway.
And just to add to that before we move on, because and it's really echoing with what Julian just said, but you know, I know when these new guidelines come along and every week you get something new, you think it changes everything, and there are subtle things that changes, there's no doubt, you know, but I think the one thing to really remember is that, you know, Executive Order 192 that was issued by the governor in November, which really I think a lot of places were following a lot of that stuff anyway with OSHA guidelines, CDC guidelines, but you know, they put it under one umbrella there. That's in effect, and that's still in full force in effect, and I think that really governs how, you know, you should deal with the workplace. So I think the whole vaccination thing, you know, while important, doesn't change the precautions you're taking within the workplace, and I think that's, you know, I think Executive Order 192 kind of underscores it.
So just a follow up, and then we can move on. So and Julian, in your role as a county, you know, administrator, so it seems like wearing face coverings, washing hands, social distancing, because you're going to need some type of booster shot. It seems like almost every year. We had a conversation with the health officers last week. This may be with us for years to come, at least when entering into a county facility.
Exactly, and part of what the science has told us as well. To that point, John, it's more like the flu in terms of transmission. It's more like the flu in terms of a possible exposure each year. So we have flu vaccines that come out each year that basically replicate all the flus up to that point to build up more resistance to what's coming in the future. So based on what we even see from the science, it doesn't look like we're going to eradicate COVID. It's just more going to be part of more of our normal lives, just in terms of flu vaccinations, and being very similar along those lines. So I think that I wouldn't be surprised if there's a seasonal basis that, hey, it's flu season and we're masking up and we're thermal scanning and people are still have plexiglass up and they still social distance. I see living with that for a while. And just noticing a question that just quickly came up, people concerned about wanting to control their own bodies and make their own decisions about whether to take vaccinations.
Right.
And understanding that, I think that's why it's very important that when we talk about mandatory vaccination, we're talking about situational and not necessarily that it ever becomes something blanket and universal that everybody has to do unless they have a medical exemption or unless they have a religious exemption. But just bringing it into practical life and something that we're already used to and see all the time. Lots of us travel and we've gone to places where to go there, we've had to get vaccinations a certain amount of time before we go there. That's been a part of our normal lives. There's certain vaccinations that are required that we all had to get as children and our children have to get now. So I think we have to also keep the context that the whole idea of mandatory vaccination is not a new concept. It's just now that we're applying it to this kind of new advent of a new disease that we've come in contact with. But depending on where the variants go and other things, I think we should all just kind of be aware and prepared for the fact that it may become mandatory at some point, just like when we travel to those other countries that you have to get particular vaccinations for.
Great, thank you, Julian. I appreciate you answering that question. We have to put up another question right now that Joe, you are welcome to read it.
Sure. Which of the following is an exemption to mandatory vaccinations? And there's a list of things: remote work, social distancing, masking, shift changes, location changes, unpaid leave. And of course, when you get a long list like that, you get all of the above, which really makes you think that that might be the answer. Not that I'm giving any hints.
So we'll leave that up for a minute, but we can certainly move forward. So in if a county municipality decides that they want to mandate the vaccine for employees, may they do it for us? And you mentioned this before, that you're may mandate it for the nursing home that the county operates. May you require it for a certain class of employees and target that population?
I think going back to the whole concept that I think you can mandate it. Yes, just based on EEOC guidelines, I think you can mandate it. But then I think you just have to be prepared, just with the advent of the fact that there are medical exemptions to it and there are religious exemptions to it, that you have to be prepared for what reasonable accommodations could be available. And again, it's getting back to the whole public health emergency aspect and looking at it from a Department of Health standpoint, looking at it from even an OSHA standpoint of, in this particular context, if there are unvaccinated employees who are working alongside their colleagues and it's a high risk environment, should they be allowed to continue in that particular environment with the health risks that they now pose to their colleagues? And I think that as this all evolves, that we'll probably get more guidance from OSHA and others, just with regard to high risk environments. I don't think it'll become mandatory in a work environment anytime soon for every particular person. But I do think that we have EO 192 and other things that have been passed. We have OSHA guidelines that have been passed. The OSHA pyramid, for example, that talks about the extreme risk, high risk environments and what types of PPE and other things that are required. I think, John, as we go through this process, we're going to see that evolve, where it's going to either start to become similar to the long-term care environment that says in this environment it is mandatory, and I think it'll probably take life in small bits like that.
Right. So maybe the county, county correctional facilities, long-term care facilities, that might be, the initial phase. And can you talk a little bit more about the exemptions, the religious exemptions, the medical exemptions and things of that nature? How and even maybe elaborate a little bit more on, if I just don't want to take the vaccine, like how do you rectify that, and how do you address that with an employee? Like what accommodations then do you make for an employee who says, I'm not getting vaccinated for a religious exemption or otherwise? What do you do then with that employee? Can you fire that? Can you terminate that employee?
Well, I think I'll start with it, because I know that this is a very, and I know Julian will have thoughts as well. This is a very, it's a very nuanced question, and that's what makes, when you're talking about mandating vaccines and going through the process, the EEOC was very careful of saying that if you have a medical reason not to do so, a religious exemption, that has to be certainly considered and honored by the employer, and you have to go through an analysis. So what it does is it requires the employer to go through this individualized analysis for each person, because in these situations it's not a one size fits all. Situation is its own domain, if you will, and you have to go through. The first thing the employer has to show, and these are the legal tests, is that an unvaccinated employee would pose a direct threat due to significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of the individual without a reasonable accommodation. And then the employer has to go through the individualized assessment, which is individualized. It's, if 5 people come to you not wanting to take it due to legitimate reasons, then you have to take a look at, the duration of the risk, the nature and severity of the harm, the likelihood that potential harm will occur, in the imminence of potential harm. And then you have to look at, what can be done. are the safeguards that we put up in the office, in the workplace, sufficient to deal with it? Is the masking and social distancing already going to cover what that individual doing, or what is their job? Is a long-term care facility, like Julian said, where, it's just those type of issues. There is going to be a threat to the employee when they're in direct care of patients, and you're going to be within the 6 feet, and so you're not going to be able to separate. You're certainly, remote work, right? The list you just showed, remote work is an accommodation, and what's been happening for a year after a year. There still are individuals and positions that could work remotely, and that still is, whether we like it or not, and feel that people should be back in the office or not. If you could effectively do remote work, then that is that is an appropriate way to handle it. So I think those factors have to be looked into. Of course, religious belief, it has to be legitimate, religious belief, in order to work it. I mean, obviously, if somebody comes to you and it's a religion you never heard of, or some belief you never, you could, look it up and determine it. But, but to get to your question, John, if there is an individual who comes to you and says, I just don't want to take it, I'm not going to do it, and it's a requirement, well, to me, that's not a legitimate, objection. And then the ball's in the employer's court as to how they want to handle it. And do I think discipline could happen at that point if it's been required and it's met all the other standards as far as, it's been held up with negotiability or not challenged or all that stuff. It's a workplace policy and you're refusing to do it. So I think that you could probably, move ahead with some
So
kind
I guess, Joe, and I have a question about the medical exemption. So say hypothetically you have a public works worker who objects and just says that I don't want to take the vaccine, right? And that worker can't work from home. Theoretically, that worker could then be ultimately disciplined or terminated. And is that the same? This is, I guess, a multiple question. If that worker has a legitimate medical reason or a religious reason, but can't work from home, then what do you do with that employee? I know that's a complicated question, but there's going to be a number of those scenarios if, in fact, an employer moves forward with mandating it to any degree.
Well, John, let me just answer that real quickly because it is so. Listen, these leave questions on any regard are so nuanced. But to me at that point, it's not unlike any situation where you have an individual who, if they can't come to work, they can't perform the essential functions of the job, and then you're going through that ADA analysis of reasonable accommodation. Do they qualify for family leave or all that stuff? You have to go through all that analysis and then go through your checklist that you have for leaves and just say, okay, they don't meet this, and see if there's an accommodation. I mean, at the end of the day, you can't hold a person's job forever if they don't want to work. But you have to go through the analysis of are there accommodations, and that's still there. So that and those things are always very like I said, they're always very nuanced. So you just can't skip those steps, and but you might not have a place for the person if they don't do it and you have it required.
John, and just to follow up on that and fully agree with Joe, I just want to for a second, because Joe did a phenomenal job on the PowerPoint, and at some point we should probably share some of those slides. But and looking at some of the questions that have been coming up in the chat, for example, has been, well, how far do you go with this? And what if there's an obese employee? Do you tell them to lose weight, et cetera, et cetera? We need to bring this back to the context of we're talking about conditions that pose an immediate risk to coworkers.
Correct.
So we're talking about communicable diseases. So no question that it should never get to the personal level of mandating things that an employee should have to do for their own personal health. This is not about their own personal health, even though that's a big byproduct of vaccinations and masking and everything else. But the whole issue is that we as employers, and particularly public employers, we have an obligation to take steps to protect people from potential threats in the workplace. So whether that's asbestos or whether it's COVID coming from our colleagues and coworkers, that's really what the whole interest is. And Joe's point again with the efforts that, and to your question, to those people who don't want to get vaccinated or even have the medical exemptions or religious exemptions, one thing that we see as an employer is going out of our way to figure out what's a reasonable accommodation. So that could be, for example, the worker who does a lot of inspection work, who now doesn't necessarily have to check in at a main office, but can do it remotely and can do a lot of their inspection work out in the field because they don't necessarily have to have a lot of interaction with coworkers. Scheduling adjustments. There's a lot of accommodations that you can come up with, and a lot of these things that I know a lot of my colleagues who are listening to this now in the other counties had to figure out when we had childcare exemptions and we had people actually out with COVID. So it's a continuation of that process, and I would think that termination, obviously, and I'm sure everybody would agree, would be the absolute last thing that you would look at, and I think that there's probably a lot of other alternatives available that you'd probably be able to come up with. And again, I hate to keep coming back to that long-term care facility example, but where it poses that level of risk to life and health, that's where I think that you get in more of those extreme environments where it really comes down to the question of whether you can accommodate it at all if someone's not going to follow a particular protocol.
So you mentioned, and thank you, that was very helpful. You mentioned making a reasonable accommodation. So say you have an employee who's taking a medical exemption to getting the vaccine, and they deal with the public on a regular basis, but they need to be on leave. Like, how do you address like an employee who needs to take leave time, I guess, while the county's making or a municipality's making a reasonable accommodation? Do they use their personal time? Do they use their sick time? Do you, like under the FERCA, do you eat the time? Like, how do you address that? An employee who goes on leave who, for whatever reason, refuses to take the vaccine, and there needs to be time to find a reasonable accommodation to them for them to return to the workforce. Does that question make sense? Kind of.
It makes sense, and I'll quickly address it just from kind of the administrative standpoint, and then I'll just defer to Joe from the legal standpoint, since he's an attorney who's actually practicing every day in the real world, and I get to enjoy it in my government world. We've been very liberal with the leave, and we've really kind of followed the lead of where the federal government has gone, where the state had gone with FERCA and other things. So there comes kind of the point in time where you have to make the determination how much of it now is going to be on the government's dime as versus from the individual using their own accrued time. And we've kind of more modulated to a point now where if you've expired your FERCA, for example, if you've expired all your personal leave time, some unions actually have contracts that allow them to borrow time as well. So I think you really have to look at all of those aspects to it, but we've pretty much tried to follow what has been coming out of the state and federal government about leave. And I understand that civil service, I think, is actually going to be coming out with some modifications to their leave policies as well. And we pretty much like to be in line with those, especially since unions cut across various employers, state being one of them.
Right. What's your thoughts on, if I could just digress for a minute, but on civil service, because they've issued maybe 2 or 3 times during the course of the year, they've issued guidance. Not every municipality, I think less than half of the municipalities in the state are in civil service. Every county, but Somerset County in New Jersey is enrolled in civil service. But so, and the guidance is typically geared towards those state employees. Is it important or advisable for a local government, whether it's a county or municipality, to follow that civil service guidance on employee leave or other matters?
I mean, I think that it certainly puts the pressure on the counties when you see that out there and you see that it applies to the states, because the state employees, because it's out there, it's something they're being provided. But legally, you don't have to follow it. It's what works. I mean, I know that certainly in the beginning, I felt that places were pretty generous with that and looking to try to follow civil service just because it was, it was a guidance when we didn't know what the law was like. I think now, now that you're a year into it and you know your situation a lot better and you're trying to work and have a handle on it, I think that to the extent that they come out with stuff in civil service that doesn't apply to counties and you feel you have a workable situation, I mean, go with what works for you. I mean, that's kind of what I would think.
And one other point too, John, is you have to be flexible.
Yeah.
And we've adapted a lot of policies, sick leave policies. Because of the advent of COVID throughout 2020, we allowed employees to carry over time, which they otherwise would have lost, and they didn't necessarily fall into civil services categories of being eligible to carry over vacation time. We allowed them to carry it over as flex time, so as not to run afoul of any existing guidelines. But we just really tried to be flexible, because knowing that we're going to need to maintain a workforce on the other side of this, and trying to figure out ways that would help us get through it as a workforce kind of all together, was really the biggest point in policy for us.
Okay, great. Thank you, gentlemen. We have a third question for you. So what does GINA stand for? Global Initiative for Asthma, Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, and Generous, Informative, Novel, Approve. I was pretty creative, Angela, that last one. All right, I have really one more question for you, and then we have a number of questions in the Q&A that I'll work my way through them. Do you guys have another 5 or 10 minutes past 11 o'clock if we're okay if we go a little over?
Sure.
All right, great. So I guess the last question I have for you is, if you can't mandate it, or if you're not going to mandate it, can you provide an incentive for employees to get the vaccine, whether it's monetary or a comp day or a personal day or something like that? Is that permitted under the law? And then separately, I mean, is that good management practice?
So I'll take the first stab at it. There is an obscure statute, NJSA 40A:5-31, which talks about award programs for local units. Now, it's not exactly on point on all squares, but it talks about how you can put together incentive programs, bonuses, different things, et cetera, for employees. I think if you want to incentivize it, it would probably be best to do it through a wellness health sort of context. If you're not going to make it mandatory, obviously, then the incentive could take that form, whether it's against healthcare contributions. A lot of it matters too. Are you self-insured? Do you go through the state health benefits program? I think from a general perspective, I think incentivizing it is a good idea when you look at the overall social benefit of trying to get as many people vaccinated as possible, and taking that on and taking your piece of responsibility as an employer to incentivize employees to get it. I think that's an overall good policy goal to try and work towards.
Yeah, and there are, I know there are questions that arisen about it. I think there's always, right, by nature as as an employer, and this is true, not only in the public sector but the private sector as well, about um, what am I going to be held liable for? And there's a concern out there, and at one point you want to say, hey, take the vaccine, it's safe. You hear the CDC come out, you hear, the government come out, everybody's pushing everybody to get the vaccine. But, at the same time, if you require it, if it's done on your premises, if you're saying, hey, go get it, and then I have, some kind of reaction or something, or I'm out, well, now, you employer, you told me to do that, and now, you're on the hook for comp, I mean, workers' comp, I think there is a presumption that you got it at the job anyway. But let's say you have a reaction to the vaccine, which, is going to be, clear. Is it, if you kind of make it voluntary as an employer, you kind of separate yourself from that. Now, there's always a cost benefit to everything, right? Is it better to, make sure you have as safe a workplace as possible and get as many people vaccinated, or do you want to, be cautious and just say, listen, we're going to take the directives that are provided. We're going to continue to provide a safe workplace. We're going to follow Executive Order 192. We're going to allow people to remote from home because we can. And if you want to get a vaccine, that's on you. And if you have reactions or whatever, well, it's not on us. Those are things to think about as well. And I know that these are issues that employers are concerned about, because it's not just hey, do the vaccine and we're good. There are flip sides to that, and it's just something to balance in your analysis. I mean, it's not, I'm certainly not saying don't have them do it because this is going to happen. I mean, I think we've been all inundated that, it's safe, it's safe, and let's hope it is. I mean, so you want to go through some questions, Sean?
Yeah, Joe, we'll go. Listen, but before we do that, I just want to, in case some folks have to jump off, or I'm sure everybody has video conferences and conference calls. It's the top of the hour. I just want to thank you and Julian for taking the time to do this. I know how incredibly busy you are, and this was very, very helpful. We will make sure to share the PowerPoint presentation, accordingly. We have one more question to answer. But again, I just really, I appreciate you doing this, and all of your advice and counsel, not just this year, but, all the years that we've been working together. I appreciate it a great deal, and trust you, you're a valued and trusted resource for me and for counties across the state. So the question is this: can an employer request proof that an employee has been vaccinated? And the answer is yes or no. We will leave that up for a little while, and we'll work our way through some of the questions. The first one is, and this was early on, and I'll if we've answered them, I won't ask.
Sure.
Will the state, and my answer is I hope not. Will the state initiate apps like ID Now, COVID Passport for everyone, education, commerce, travel? I don't. I'll take this, Julian or Joe. I mean, unless you know something, I don't know. We're on regular, calls with the administration. I haven't heard anything like this yet. If they do it, I hope they find a very reputable and effective vendor to do it on their behalf, so we don't run into the same issues like we do with DMV and labor and the NJVSS system. So I hope not. We answered that question. I don't know. We talked about this. Could an employer request verification of receiving a vaccine, or is verbal attestation adequate? So we talked about that, but that's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, is verbal adequate? I mean, my understanding is you get some kind of card or something that shows that you've had the vaccine. So since it's not, I'm just trying to think rationally here. Since the EEOC has determined it's not a medical examination, as long as the card itself doesn't have any information on it that would lead you to some of the other things I talked about before, I'd want to see the card, not just have somebody say, yeah, I got the vaccine, because then if they didn't and then they spread COVID around, you're going to say, well, he told me. yes, I think you're going to be in a bad spot. So I'd rather not have the verbal. I don't know if you feel differently, Julian.
I actually agree because I'm thinking if let's say it's a high risk environment and one employee makes a complaint and says, I don't think my colleagues were vaccinated, I was, and OSHA or POSHA is investigating it, and they ask us as an employer, how are you verifying people are vaccinated? A verbal, I don't think would carry the day, so I agree that you should just get proof in written form, and everybody gets the card, like you said.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah.
All right, great. I think we answered a couple of these questions here, but I have one. Let's see. I'm going to read it. It's a little long, but do you see an adaptation for sick leave policies or amending definitions to provide flexible leave banks for work from home days in addition to scheduled flex schedules? The balance is always about leave viewed as an entitlement versus a benefit and abuse. For example, as a parent, if my child has a doctor's appointment, I would typically have to take the entire day. So I think you spoke a little bit about that, Julie, before in terms that, you've been flexible. Is there anything that you want to, kind of add to that?
I would just add that the work from home option, obviously, if you're working from home, you don't have to take any sort of leave time. So that's another added benefit of the whole telecommuting environment is that you're actually still working. So that's not, you don't need any leave for that.
Great. Thank you, sir. So how should it be handled when an employee has side effects and takes the day off after receiving the vaccine? Again, I think the county would be, and most municipalities are flexible, but Julian or Joe, I mean, should they use their personal time or like under FERCA, it's
You give them a day. We
Yeah.
actually give the employees the day. We allow a day for a COVID vaccination kind of recovery. So we allow a day for that on
And
our
I think-
time. Yeah.
And I think that that's good labor relations. What Julian's saying there. So, I'm always one for working together. And that's what it is, working together. It's a trust factor. It's having, individuals, if you're going to encourage people to take the vaccine, could you, would it characterize as a sick day under the CBA and you could charge them? Yes, you can. And, and you'd win that grievance. But, if you want people to get it and you show a little flexibility, like Julian's saying there, I don't know how many points that wins you, but that type of stuff matters. So I think it's what you feel, works best for it. I mean, hopefully, from what I understand is that, if you get that second shot or, you might have a day or two of some side effects. That seems to be what the science is saying.
This is actually a good question that I want to broaden a little bit. Is there case law addressing whether teachers are essential employees? I don't know if this, I mean, I'd like to broaden that question because, again, under FERCA and the definition of essential employees kind of was very broad and really left to the discretion of the governing body to determine. So, Julian or Joe, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, is it still really left to the discretion of the employer to determine who and who is not an essential employee?
It is.
Yeah.
I actually firmly think it is. And one thing that COVID has shown us is that the definition of who is the essential employee can change.
Right.
And one of the advents we saw, essential workers became grocery store clerks and a number of other people who had to go to work on a daily basis. So I think that is still just a very flexible definition.
I do think it's for the employer to determine, and then probably for the union to argue that they are not. I mean, that is certainly something that would be a fight, but I do think that the public employer, as long as they have a legitimate governmental reason to say this is why the individual is an essential employee for this instance, as long as you're making good faith legitimate arguments, especially in the time of COVID, I would think it would hold up, but would be subject to a challenge, of course.
But just on the teacher context, it's hard to say that teachers are not essential, because I'm trying to figure out how a school operates without teachers. But
True.
So we have a number of questions. I honestly don't think, and I'm mindful of Joe and Julian's time, we're going to get to all of them. I put my email, if you don't have it, in the chat box. If you have a question, please send it to my email, and I will forward it to Joe and Julian, and I know that they will get back to me. We'll take 2 or 3 more questions, and I think we're going to have to end it because, again, I know how busy both of you gentlemen are. This is from Dr. Conaway in Burlington County. And this is actually, there's something to think about. Wouldn't an incentive program merely encourage someone to be vaccine hesitant, as opposed to maybe incentivizing them to get the vaccine?
Definitely a psychological question.
Right.
Here. And,
Right.
But no, but and I say that, I say that as, that's a great way of thinking about it. I think where the incentivization works, and I tried to make this point before, is that if you're in these sectors where, and I think Julian brought up the right point about taking a look at your workforce and determining, where do you really want these, and where do these individuals really need the vaccine, because it's going to create a safer workplace for where they are, versus places where, listen, you could sit there and say, I'd rather have everybody vaccinated because it just creates more safety in the workplace, allows people to return quicker, hopefully. And it's really the compromise of not mandating and not have to go through all the hoops and sit there and negotiate and say, listen, this is up to you, but you have it. I understand that every time there's something attached, that it creates some kind of distrust of, well, why is it there? I think it's something to think about in it. I don't think that's a wrong way. I think it's an excellent point. I just don't know how to really, it's just a way of trying to have alternatives to the mandatory aspect, but still try to get people in to do it. That's really the whole thought of the incentivization.
I agree, and I think that the incentivization should probably be the last kind of attempt after you've gotten a certain amount of the population and others vaccinated. And it might even be the last ditch attempt before you try and shift to something mandatory. Because I get the point that if there's an incentive, I'm going to hold out because I want the incentive. But
Right.
I think that the timing will dictate that. And I think if it's later, much later in a process, much later where we see where we are with COVID and a number of people have been vaccinated and it's generally available, typically those who are holding out at that point are holding out for some reason after it's already been generally available. So I think as far as those who could take advantage of it, just from that standpoint, you've at least greatly minimized that population.
Great. I have this will be the last series of questions, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. And there's a number of questions, and I hear this a lot, where folks compare COVID to to the flu, and why are we going to mandate the COVID vaccine and and not the flu. So I think there's going to be a lot of folks kind of struggling with that, particularly if an employer mandates that an employee is vaccinated for COVID-19. I don't know if I have a question in there, but I do have one with, but I'm seeing a lot of comments and questions about that. So if an employee contracts COVID, will that employee be mandated then to get the vaccine? Or if, again, there's a mandatory vaccine policy in place. And I understand that if someone can't get vaccinated, this is, again, there's so much information, out there. My understanding from speaking with the health officers is that someone actually can't get vaccinated for 2 weeks until 2 weeks after that they receive, COVID, and then the antibodies are effective for 90 days. I wish Dr. Conaway could, chime in. That's my general understanding.
I thought you couldn't, listen, I know this through, not disclosing my own personal medical information, because I luckily haven't had COVID, knock wood, but I think knowing people who've had COVID, I think it's 90 days you can't get the vaccine for. I think that's what it is. I'm not 100% sure of that. That's what it's always, again, the verbal, it's always dangerous to go off, but I would think people who've had it are in the know. But getting, I think the one thing we have to think about here is I know there's a concern from people and a skepticism of the slippery slope of what will happen with COVID. And I don't foresee that happening for this reason. Is in all of our lifetimes, unless we have, people in the triple digits on this call, nothing has shut down the world for a year like this has. So I think if you are going to say, if you're going to have a rule for how to deal with COVID, I really do think there can be a bright line to separate COVID from other issues, because in our lifetimes, the flu hasn't shut down businesses for months and months and months of time. So I think that the fear of what this will ultimately lead to, I'd want to see complete shutdown for months and months before you could even start to make that argument. That's my hope in the law, and that there would be a rational approach to dealing with this if I had to take a shot at it.
Julian, gentlemen, any final thoughts? And again, if you have any questions that we didn't answer, please send them to my email and we will get to you. But Joe or Julian, any closing thoughts before we wrap it up?
Just a final thought, and just with regard to the flu again, when we look at it in context and we look at the lives lost with regard to COVID, the flu is nothing compared to COVID. So I think we're dealing with a completely different kind of public health emergency. So obviously the efforts that have to be used have to be obviously a little bit more aggressive and extreme than addressing the flu. But just as a final thought, John, I have to thank you because putting this together and the amount of information that you provide, and I know I speak on behalf of my other county colleagues, you keep us informed, you keep us abreast, you keep us on our toes, and what you've done is invaluable. Joe, I certainly hope that we do share the PowerPoint, because the effort that went into that, I'm telling you, it's an excellent product, and all of us should have it and keep in our back pockets. But again, just thank you very much for all your help.
Yeah, and I'll align with that. Certainly, John, that could be shared with the people today. And listen, we covered a lot of it, and I think it is, it's a resource for you. Certainly, I echo Julian's remarks as well. I mean, John, you do such a great job, and I really enjoyed having the interaction with Julian, because I think, as you could see, this is an evolving issue that doesn't have, if you're looking for bright line answers, they don't exist. But I think discussion with your decision makers, with your legal counsel, will lead you to getting close to what you need to do with that. And I hope that, seeing, Julian and I speak today, although I think we had a lot of agreement on things, you see kind of some different thoughts. And I think that, while I was on a little more legal, I think you saw that Julian, certainly in practice, and is a very, very bright guy, has definite great practical solutions that I hope all of you kind of jumped on, and will use that in your consideration of this going forward. So again, thanks for the opportunity, John. Always like talking to this group. Always a lot of fun.
Great. And thank you again, Joe. Thank you, Julian, and thank everyone for participating. We appreciate it, and hope to see you next week for medicated assisted treatment at our county jail. So have a great day, and thanks again. Appreciate it.
Take care, guys.